Hi, my name is Tina Olson, and I'm here today to help moderate um, the Jim Crow Reparations presentation by Asa Gordon. And go ahead and take it over, please.
Okay, let's see. And, okay, is my okay. The slide is displaying here. My monitor is going in and out here, so I'm a little off there. Okay,
Yes, we see the slide.
okay.
Thank you. Very cool.
All right. This workshop is no taxation without is about Jim Crow reparations. Now, this is a little personal. I know there's been a lot about reparations for slavery. Um, Forgive me if I get a little personal, but before we get to reparations for over slavery, I'm living. I need some reparations for me for what happened in my lifetime. You know, um, and so this will focus on reparation. You know, very often you hear this thing, well, my parents wasn't alive at that time. I had nothing to do with it. Well, I want you to understand that if you were my age, your parents voted for the type of system that kept me to go into a segregated school. Your parents, if they lived in the South, did nothing to try to restrict that government from restricting my opportunities at education. So there's a debt owed to those who are victim of oppression that are still living like me today. No taxation without representation is a founding principle of our national existence. No taxation for perverse representation is the optimum principle for Jim Crow era legacy reparations. Reparations for living victims of Jim Crow to compensate for the direct compensation of the resources of Jim Crow era ancestors to subsidize state sponsored economic and educational white privilege. To subsidize state statutory Jim Crow, taxation was, integrated in its collection, but it was segregated. It was colorblind when it collected the taxes, but it was not so colorblind when its distribution. A founding principle of our nation's existence is no taxation without representation. But we should have what we have for Jim Crow era was taxation for perverse representation. Thus, all federal and state taxes paid by people of color throughout the statutory Jim Crow era from 1890 to 1965 to subsidize state governments devoid of representation by people of color are entitled to reimbursement to a general state revenue fund dedicated to redress the state's Jim Crow legacy. By way of personal example, I am specifically entitled to tax free ancestral Jim Crow tax reparations with interest for the disparate Jim Crow education allocation for state revenues assessed on my parents, my daddy, and my granddaddy to subsidize my public education subject to Jim Crow statutes in the state of Georgia from 1946 to 1959. Furthermore, I should be personally exempt from paying any contemporary federal or state taxes for a period equal to the period that I was personally subject to Jim Crow laws. This should apply to all living victims of Jim Crow. It is past time to make whole contemporary living victims of Jim Crow, like me, myself, I, by reimbursing the taxes assessed on the Jim Crow era minority generation to sustain state sponsored white supremacy with the acquiescence of the national government. And national apology and reparations for the descendants of enslaved ancestors is an ongoing subject of debate. Reparations for living victims of the Jim Crow era redemption of white supremacy is identifiable, undeniable, and reasonably non debatable. All contemporary living victims born in the era of statutory Jim Crow and subject to the laws thereof are entitled to Jim Crow era reparations. All Jim Crow era legacy victims are entitled to reimbursement of all enabling federal taxes and state taxes that were assessed on my daddy, my great granddaddy, and my great granddaddy that aided and abetted Jim Crow and white privilege by statutory oppression of blacks. Now, some will argue that it is unreasonable and overly generous to request reparations for Jim Crow descendants that is limited only to compensation of taxes assessed on black ancestors to subsidize the state in their own oppression. Some will argue it is reasonable that whites who benefited from Jim Crow era taxation to maintain white privilege should be assessed to fairly augment reparations for Jim Crow. It is past time for debate on the calculation and the scope of Jim Crow era legacy reparations to begin. It is past time to compensate now the identifiable living victims of taxation for our ongoing legacy of white privilege representation. Here, let's get a little into the statistics of how the disparate taxation was used in order to decree white privilege and advantage. The disparate Jim Crow allocation education ratios for the 1930s are provided in Jim Crow schools by Peter Lyons. Here's a quote from his work. The obstacles facing black children who thirsted for education in the 1930s, the great grandparents of today's black students, were enormous. More than 3 million school age black children live in the 17 states that continue to operate separate schools, along with 81% of all the nation's 81% of all the nation's black population. In the Jim Crow states that stretch from Delaware to Texas, local school boards spent almost 3 times as much on each white student as they did on blacks. The funding disparities in the Deep South states, where blacks outnumbered whites in hundreds of rural communities, were far greater. Alabama spent $37 on each white child in 1930 to just $7 on those who were black. In Georgia, figures were $32 to 7. In Mississippi, they were 31 to 6. And those in South Carolina, $53 to $5, a disparity of more than 10 to 1. This was an act for an established concerning schools for freemen in January 16, 1866. And what it is say the provision is made for schools for freemen right after doing Reconstruction. One of the first things that blacks did when they entered into Reconstruction Congress was to try to raise revenues in order to establish free schools. And they took out and so for what they did was they passed Texas, the superintendent to establish schools for freemen when the number of children of persons of color in any county or counties will warrant the same, provided the funds provided for shall be sufficient to meet the expenses thereof. By another act, the interest from the school fund of the state is applied to the education of indigent white children. What they did was they passed what they call black codes to dismantle those free schools, and they confiscated the taxes that had been raised for those schools and put it into resources for blacks, for white kids. We should have reparations for what is called Jim Crow poll taxes. A poll tax is a tax of a fixed sum on every liable individual, typically every adult, without reference to income or resources. So on its surface, it appears to be colorblind. Payment of a poll tax was a prerequisite to the registration for voting in a number of states until 1965. The tax emerged in some states of the United States in the late 19th century as a part of the Jim Crow laws. After the right to vote was extended to all races by the enactment of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, a number of states enacted poll tax laws as a device for restricting voting rights. The laws often included a grandfather clause, which allowed any adult male whose father or grandfather had voted in a specific year prior to the abolishment of slavery to vote without paying the tax. In other words, if your great granddaddy would have been a slave owner, then he was exempt for paying the tax. Proof of payment of a poll tax was a prerequisite to voter registration in Alabama from 1901 to 1966. Arkansas, 1891 to 1964. Florida, 1875 to 1937. Mississippi, 1890 to 1966. North Carolina, 1900 to 1920. Texas, 1902 to 1960. Virginia. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, abolished the use of the poll tax or any other tax. The problem is all of the poll taxes that my ancestors paid in order to subsidize their own discrimination, that should go into an escrow account in every one of those states with interest, and for a education fund for all those who are descendants of the Jim Crow era. Here's a receipt for the payment of a poll tax in Jefferson Parish that was paid out, of received by its white, paid to the sum of $1, which is equivalent to $20 in 2020. So all of the poll taxes, one way we can get some sources for education in the state is to look at all of the poll taxes that was paid by my ancestors, updated to the interest of what its value would be today, and that go into a special account only for us folks. Now, I'm not even talking about white folks' money. I'm just talking about colored folks' money. Give us the money that we spent for you to oppress us. Reparations for Jim Crow supermajorities. Now, I want you to understand that the techniques that were used in order to reestablish white supremacy are still being used today in order to establish white privilege. That is the invention of what is called supermajorities in order to establish legislation. As late as 2018, there is a potential historical election on the horizon in Florida's go to the ballot box to choose representation and decide upon potential changes to the state constitution. This is in 2018 now. They may not realize the upsetting history connected to the measures they are considering. While Amendment 4, that repairs a discriminatory Jim Crow era policy, Amendment 5 would institute a policy that first emerged in 1890 in Mississippi as part of the white backlash to funding schools and service for African Americans. If passed, Amendment 4 will reverse the state's discriminatory felony disfranchisement law. That's good. That amendment went to a referendum. It was passed. Unfortunately, they have now reversed it. But the amendment we have to be concerned about is the supermajority requirement scheme, like the one in Amendment 5, which originated in Jim Crow, Mississippi. If passed, Amendment 5 would require two-thirds, a supermajority vote of the state legislature to approve any state revenue, taxes, and fees, or eliminate tax incentives, loopholes, and other such expenditures. As outlined by the Institute's recent brief, Florida lawmakers continue to cut investments for critical public services while relying on an upside down tax system, one in which families with the lowest income contribute the most as a share of their incomes. Amendment 5 would cement in place Florida's inequitable tax system and low investment in public services, locking in inequality for generations to come. The disproportionate impact of Amendment 5 has roots in the very first use of a supermajority requirement to raise taxes in the United States in 1890 in Mississippi. During the post-Civil War Reconstruction period, Southern state legislatures for the first time were tasked with building schools and providing services for formerly enslaved peoples. As the Oregon Center for Public Policy reported, wealthy former slave owners in the South revolted against investing their tax dollars toward going for services for African Americans. In Mississippi, they band together to protect themselves from future tax increases and devised the nation's first supermajority requirement to raise taxes and revenues. They were likely to have at least a minority of seats in the state legislature for the foreseeable future. That is because the number of former slaves in the state of Mississippi, they were the majority. And so what they did was set up a legislature that in essence said that if whites ever become a minority in any state legislature in the future, we will be able to checkmate any majority with requiring a supermajority for them to raise any taxes on us to try to compensate or raise revenues for infrastructure, for roads, or for schools. I want you to understand that is the exact psychology that is existing right now. It appears that, are you still getting my,
Yes, we're getting it.
Yeah, we're still here. Yep.
am I back? Hold on. I'm not seeing my, are you still seeing my slide? I'm not seeing it on my screen.
Yes, we
The
see it.
disproportionate impact of Amendment 5. That slide, number 10.
Okay, you see it. Okay, I'm not
Yeah,
seeing it on
yeah.
my, okay. The disproportionate impact of Amendment 5 has roots in the very first supermajority. What was happening here is that they're trying to sell me something on my screen. I'm sorry. So I'm a little confused here. So what is happening is as the former slaves they began to make up the majority right after Reconstruction in the southern states in some of the legislatures. It was the majority in South Carolina and Louisiana. So the first thing they did was try to pass, to raise revenues to rebuild the South that was in disrepair, and rebuild that legislature, and build schools and roads and infrastructure throughout the devastated South. They had to raise taxes. So a natural place the taxes was on the former large plantation slave owners. What they did was, all right, when they finally overturned Reconstruction and got back in power, they say we want to create a system of government so that if whites ever lose power to a non-white majority in the future, we will set up a legal constitutional system that will make it almost impossible for them to raise taxes on us to try to correct any inequities. I want you to understand that. So what they did is say that was the origin of the supermajority. So well, what we will do is require a supermajority on any attempt for a state to raise taxes. That exists in every one of the southern states today. So even if blacks win the governorship, the legislature in these southern states, they have it set up so that a white minority can checkmate a majority in the House and in the Congress in these states from passing legislation in order to correct inequities in these states. Revenue and future executive politics in post-Civil War Florida were also infused by white backlash. In addition to the vagrancy laws mentioned above, the racist black code laws in Florida included several provisions regarding taxation. Are y'all seeing this slide? Because I can't on my monitor.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. In 1866, the Florida legislature passed laws establishing schools for African Americans, but stipulated that they would be paid for only with taxes levied on formerly enslaved individuals, and that the state's education fund was only for white schools. In 1868, the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, giving equal protection under the law and undermining the legality of Southern black codes. However, Florida and other Southern states responded by passing segregationist Jim Crow laws and continued to fight back against the federal government push for equality under the law. Reparations for Jim Crow supermajority reparations. A century went by before the first supermajority requirement to raise taxes emerged. Its place and time reveal much about the nature of supermajority requirements. The South at the dawn of the Jim Crow era. Fast forwarding to 2018, or fast forwarding to what is happening in the requirement of a supermajority in order to get anything passed in Congress today in order to redress resources for the poor. I want you to understand that the origin of the supermajority was in direct response of the fear of what kind of taxes would be assessed on former slave owners by former slaves who were now into the house. That is how critical race theory makes you understand how the institution that is affecting you today, that Jim Manchin is ignorant of or ignoring of, is the why it was set up so that a white minority could check a white majority that may move to undermine white privilege and white supremacy. Forwarding to 2018 in terms of supermajority, special interests to continue contributing a relatively low share of their income taxes, while the rest of the state would pay the price in terms of cuts to schools, roads, bridges, and mental health care following the next economic crisis. During the brief period of Reconstruction following the end of the Civil War, Southern state legislatures for the first time began providing for schools and other services for the recently freed African American population. Some whites resisted, sometimes violently. They eventually seized control and rolled back the progress. In the power struggle that ensued in Mississippi, a faction of wealthy former slaveholders demanded and won a change to the state's constitution to shield themselves from tax increases. In a throwback to the Free Fifths Clause in counting former slaves in order to give disproportionate representation to a minority of slaveholders in the Congress to give them power in checkmating efforts to dismantle slaves, they use a Free Fifths Clause vote requirement for all tax increases. That remains in place to this day. The Free Fifths Clause was used in essence to say if black folks ever get the government, it's going to take a supermajority of them in order to change anything, no matter, even if they have power, to try to change the power structure or bring about equity. That is what is happening in Congress today. That three-fifths supermajority was a brainchild that was used in redemptionists in order to preserve and protect former slaveholders and their property and from being their property being taxed in order to fund school, bridges, and even the reconstruction of the devastated Southern after the Civil War. Over the next few decades of the Jim Crow era, Louisiana and Arkansas would follow suit in adopting a supermajority requirement for tax increases. From its origins in the Deep South, the idea of the supermajority requirement spread west in the late 1970s, spurred on by special interest groups that also recognized the power it confers on the wealthy few. It arrived in Oregon in 1996. In other words, Jim Crow got hip all over the world, all over the country. He said, in the form of Measure 25, requiring a three-fifths vote of the legislature for any bill to raise revenue. Many people are ignorant of the fact that these laws exist in their statute. They say, well, why can't they do something? Why can't they raise revenues? They don't understand that there are laws in the book that goes all the way back to the redemption era following Reconstruction to reestablish white supremacy to prevent Congress from those type of revenues to this day. Today, 16 states have some kind of supermajority requirement in taxation. Founding fathers, now this is disrespectful of how the founding fathers thought about supermajority. The undemocratic nature of the supermajority requirements that attracted former slaveholding legislators post Civil War also alarmed the founding fathers. Alexander Hamilton called them poison to democracy. What was happening, they were concerned with the supermajority they had to put in the Constitution in order to make any amendments to the Constitution in order to satisfy the slave owners to the delegates to the Constitution who say we ain't signing on nothing unless you give us enough power by counting our slaves and giving us disproportionate affirmative action for white supremacy in this Constitution to checkmate you if you try to vote our institutions out of existence because most of the free whites live in the North. And so Alexander Hamilton called them poison to democracy because they would allow entrenched, I'm quoting special interests in a minority of the legislatures to block the will of the majority. James Madison, who's sometimes referred to as the father of the Constitution, stated that supermajority requirements undermine the fundamental principle of free government because they allow an empowered few to take advantage and extort unreasonable indulgences to allow the will of the people to move forward. Founding fathers. So here's a direct quote of how the founding fathers viewed the supermajority requirements for legislation. Alexander Hamilton had some strong statements against supermajority requirements for the purpose of legislating, really for governing. Specifically, he wrote about this in Federalist 22. Quote, its operation contradicts the fundamental maxim of Republican government, which requires that the sense of the majority should prevail. But this is not all. What at first seems to maybe seem a remedy is in reality a poison. To give a minority a negative upon the majority, which is always the case where more than a majority is directed to a decision, is in its tendency to subject the sense of the greater number to that of the lesser. Its real operation is to embarrass the administration, to destroy the energy of the government, and to substitute the pleasure, caprice, or artifices of an insignificant, to substitute the pleasure, caprice of an insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junto to the regular deliberations and decisions of a respectable majority. The public businesses must, in some way or other, go forward. If a pernicious minority can control the opinions of the majority, respecting the best mode of conducting it, the majority, in order that something may be done, must conform to the views of the minority. And thus, the sense of the smaller number will overrule that of the greater and give a tone to the national proceedings. Hence, tedious delays, continued negotiation, and indulgence takes place. I'm sorry. And so Madison, hold on, I'm losing track here. Can you still see me? Okay, now, so what James Madison also spoke out against supermajorities for it's done as being counter to the principle of democracy. So there's no founding father rationale for this adherence to supermajority. The only legacy of a supermajority is the legacy to maintain and property rights of former slave owners and white supremacy and privilege. Reparations for Jim Crow sales tax. The first modern sales tax in 1932, Mississippi adopted the nation's first modern retail sales tax. a tax that generally falls hardest on those with the least income because sales tax consume a larger share of the income. The state's governor urged adopting the new tax in part by emphasizing that the revenue would be used to reduce the property taxes, and that as a result, it would shift the state tax base away from property owners and more heavily onto consumers. What that meant in practice was a reduction in taxes owned by mostly white property owners and an increase in those owned by black households that owned little or no property and had little else to tax. Other states across the country adopted the sales taxes not long after Mississippi demonstrated the tax feasibility in a significant raise on tax. So that is the purpose of a sales tax, to shift the tax burden from property to those to those to consumption. And you buy into that because and that and that is how the tax favor property owners. Here, can you see the slide of the Freeman's Bureau? Is that showing up?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. Uh, the, the kind of politics that affects us to this day of our concern over spending our taxes to the government rose up in the government when they established the Freeman's Bureau. If you see there, say an agent to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. This is the mentality that still exists in the resistance of, of paying taxes to the government to this day. You see, twice vetoed by the president and made a law by Congress. Now, if you can look closely at that, it shows a characterization of a slave there who's saying, what is the use of doing work if the government makes all these preparations? And on the left, they show that the white man has to work for his pay, while the black man just spends to just coast on government taxes. This mentality that goes all the way to the establishment of the Freeman's Bureau, which actually was a bureau that was called the Bureau of Land Reparations and Land for Abandoned Land and Reparations, in order to assist in the reconstruction of the devastated South, is the same mentality that existed in the South today against giving any money to the government for reparations or for any kind of infrastructure, because it's just going to go to people for those who want to use the government that not even work. The wealth is 10% of white households own 2/3 of U.S. wealth. Here is the share. The share owned by 10% of the white household, they're 20% of the population of the household, but they control 65% of the wealth. 22% shared by other white holes who control 22%. So 87% of the wealth is owned by white households altogether, and 13% shared by all other households. People of color hold disproportionately fewer states and state legislature. Here is the percent of black of the state legislation in the state and percent of the U.S. population. You can see that the only African Americans are 12% of the population, but they only make up 8.6% of the state legislatures. African percent of islands 5 and 1%. The only population that actually is overrepresented in state legislatures as the percent of the population is non-Hispanic whites. That is the only population that is overrepresented in state legislatures in reference to their population. All other races underperform in their representation in state legislature compared with their registration population. The lowest income household, because you have accepted, because we have become accrued to favoring property in our tax schemes, Here's what how the lowest 20% pays 11% of their 11.4% of their income in taxes. The top 1% pays only 7%. That is, the poorer you are, the more you pay relative to your income. Compared the more money you pay, the less you pay relative to your income. That is inverse. That is how the structure of the tax system was set up, because of the fear that some of the money may go to them and not to us. 2013 tax cuts worsen. Here's what happened recently in 2013. We see is compares the share of the tax reduction received in the 2013 tax cuts in North Carolina. Black share of the taxpayers were 22%, but their share of taxpayers were 22%, but they got about half of that in taxes. I mean, in tax rebate, whereas whites got now. Oh, wait a minute. I don't want to go to that now. This was a presentation I made at the Civil War Round Table. Can you see this video?
Yes, we can.
You're looking at someone who, not by choice, I could not go to the university by law. I had to leave the state. So before we get there, I want what I call Jim Crow reparations. Here's how it works. So you come out there, that happened way back then. I said, okay, let's talk about what you owe me. Here's what you owe me. All the time that you collected taxes from my mama and my dad to support my segregation, you integrated in the collection, you segregated in the distribution. So
Could you turn up your volume, please?
all the taxes that were put in the 7 states to aid and abet segregation with interest, I'm going to be finished. You don't even have to take white folks from it. Just take the money that colored folks put to subsidize their own oppression. You take that money and that becomes an escrow account for all the students of Jim Crow living, Jim person like me, like my wife, so that my daughter and my son will be able to draw on tax money that my ancestors, my mama and my daddy, not my great dad, paid in order to subsidize you oppressing me. So now, if that's what your generation did to my generation, I'm living, you still living. So don't talking about what your great, don't make me, and when your great granddaddy was voting for a tax system of segregation, you know, your daddy was alive and my daddy was alive. And I was living under that oppression. You did nothing to vote those clowns out of office. So you participated in aiding my having to catch it. I had to catch the streetcar. I had to pay token to catch the streetcar to go to school. I didn't even have school buses. The school buses were for the white kids. It wasn't until I got to high school that I could get a school bus. And then we got one broken down school bus that you had to get out all the time to help push when it got to a hill. You know, so I hope I'm not upsetting someone else talking about we need reparations for slavery. I'm being a little selfish here, but I want reparations that you owe me personally for what you did in my time. Let's have reparations for Jim Crow. I hope you got that, man, because I'm gonna use that. All right, that was from a presentation I made at a Civil War roundtable recently on and I mean, the reason I'm in trouble today is that there's something on my screen say a lead of the 2020 Garden of Magic Quadrant for Meeting Solutions. Garden of Words lead is I don't know what is happening. It's popped up on my screen trying to sell me something, and um, so let me see if I stop the chair and start it again. If I can. All right.
Yeah, it's probably just a pop-up, my guess, but that's annoying.
That's what it is. Okay, let me. It was something I wanted to show you that James Madison. I wanted to get the quote from Madison. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can see that.
James Madison on the supermajority. This is what he had said in Federalist 58. Quote, in all cases where justice or the general good might require new laws to be passed or active measures to be pursued, the fundamental principles of free government would be reversed. It would be no longer the majority that would rule. The power would be transferred to the minority, where the defensive privilege limited to the particular cases, an interested minority might take advantage of it to screen themselves from equitable sacrifices to the general weal, or in particular emergencies, to extort unreasonably indulgences. I mean, they were right on target of what is going on with supermajority requirement in order to pass infrastructure, in order to pass the voting rights bill today. And so with Jim Crow, by focusing on Jim Crow reparations, it will highlight and it will kind of bring to forefront just how laws that were enacted in order to implement Jim Crow are still operating in the books today. Even though Jim Crow is dead, what is not dead, even though Jim Crow what has not been removed, is the type of tax schemes that they set up in order to preserve a minority property interest. That is the legacy of Jim Crow that prevents even whites from trying to, even if you have a majority of whites who are trying to do something that's equitable, they can be checkmated by a white minority whose primary interest is to preserve white privilege. And so if you cut, the only way you can understand this and learn this is by this thing they call critical race theory. Now understand how these institutions of racism would set in place certain institutional methods of governance and taxation that makes it structurally impossible to bring out an equitable society today. And you can only understand that if you understand how these systems got into place. Now, I understand. Let me give you a thing. Recently we have now the tearing down of Confederate monuments. One, what people don't realize that in some states, when I was involved in trying to get the Confederate flag moved in South Carolina, I warned the black legislators in South Carolina that you got to be very careful with what some of the black legislators were doing in cooperating with whites in what they call bipartisan compromise to bring down the flag. And in that bipartisan compromise, where I attacked the black congressmen in South Carolina, they did it also in Georgia, is they made a deal: if you symbolically remove the flag, we would allow you to pass legislation that in essence protect all Confederate monuments throughout the state, irrespective of any future government from removing them without a supermajority requirement. So that's why in some of these states, like it exists in Virginia, it exists in Texas, they're actually what called Confederate civil religion protection laws. And so some of these movements, so even when you become mayor of in a Confederate of a of a state, a city in a Confederate state, and you try to change Stonewall Jackson Avenue into Martin Luther King Avenue, you actually are prevented from doing by state law in some of these states. And so that's on the side of but what they're kind of looking away from that because it's so blatant. They're allowing those laws, state laws, to be violated and removing some of these Confederate monuments. But what is still in place is the inequitable tax systems they have that require supermajorities in order to raise taxes on property, in order to raise taxes on certain things that may improve the infrastructure. And so that's why there's an emphasis on going to sales taxes, which is a regressive tax, you know, in order to escape, because in some of these states they are prevented, they can't get a supermajority to file a tax on property. So if they wanted to file it, make increase the taxes on capital gains, and say we should tax capital gains and income as we do income, you will find in some states you require a supermajority to do that, so they can make that kind of revenue. That kind of psychology, the psychology of former slave owners who was concerned that former governments would be made up of a black population that was the majority in a lot of these southern states. They made up the majority of the population in order to protect themselves against a minority that may tax them in the future. They set up these schemes, which are the same schemes that was adopted in Congress to require supermajority in order to pass certain legislation. That came out of Jim Crow, redemptionist, white supremacist methods in order to preserve white supremacy. And so I'm advocating that the Green Party put a highlight on these on Jim Crow reparations in order to really as a subterfuge to educate the public as to how these, if you want to understand your frustration in getting the state to raise revenues to do any equitable reparations today, where it comes from, where it exists, and also undercut any moral link that they try to make to the founding fathers, because the founding fathers saw this also. And I'll close with this slide. He said, founding fathers derided supermajority requirements. Southern elites realized the same thing Madison and Hamilton knew. Supermajority requirements empower a superminority to game the system in their favor. The difference between the founding fathers and the Southern elites, of course, was the founding sought to create, at least for the white males, a representative democracy serving the common good, while the latter sought to preserve a system of privilege built upon racial segregation and oppression. So confiscating the Jim Crow reparations will lead to reparations for all of us once we understand. But like I say, it's personal. I'm starting up a retirement, what called a college education fund for my kids. I think it should be funded for all of those taxes that my daddy paid when I went to a segregated school. I'm not talking about my dad. I myself went to a segregated school. At least all of the taxes that went into all the time that I spent in segregated schools should become into a fund for my grandchildren in their tax deferred income. So there are all kind of methods that we can use to calculate what kind of compensation should become from Jim Crow reparations. But we should begin that process now. And we should begin that process of educating those, all of us, as to how Jim Crow set forth the system in which it created a system that ensures property over people. And I'm opening up for questions, comments on joining us.
Thank you. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. If you have questions, you can raise your hand if you can do that, or you can type
Okay,
questions.
let me stop this. I'm gonna stop the share here and see if this go back to
Sure.
stream. I don't know what's going on. Okay. Oh, now.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. And let me see. I don't even see how to unmute myself here. Okay. So Morgan, I know you entitled some reparations.
You're right, definitely.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So how does the racial covenants on mortgages in relation to property taxes? And I know here in Minnesota, our property taxes are help fund schools.
Yeah. And so one reason they put it on the property taxes as the basis for funding schools, they say, well, black folks ain't got no property. So we put the taxes on property, we can assure that at least the white folks will get some funding for schools, and the funding for blacks will be, and matter of fact, in some of those places, they set it up that property taxes for the black schools will come from the taxes that are raised on property of blacks. The funds for white schools will come from the taxes that are raised on property owned by whites, and that is showed in equity. and the way we would even increase that is don't sell no black folks no property. The other thing is now a way they did on limited property taxes, and the way they use property taxes in order to raise extra avenues. Morgan, I don't know if you know that, but during the eras in the 60s, what we found is that in Savannah, what they did is they found a list of most of the black leaders who were leading the protests in order to integrate the pools at that time in Savannah. They actually, the assessors were all white, so they increased the property taxes, the assessment on the value. They put a higher value of the blacks who were leading protesters in the South, so they would have to pay higher taxes on their properties. And they caught on about this spread to the North. In the North, they actually started putting higher assessment, disproportionate assessment on black property than they did on white property to tax them out of their, taxation is one way of destruction. So there has been studies that have found that blacks had a disproportionate higher assessment in taxing in their property taxes than whites. That's another way. Now that's another avenue. You look at that disparateness in the disproportionate assessment of taxes on black property, put that in an escrow account, and that be part of the revenue for Jim Crow taxes. Jim Crow that comes from limited, improper assessment of taxes of property. So they had all this goes back. If you want to understand the complexities of how property got the upper hand in getting all these breaks, that goes all the way to to this time. You can go back to what the slave owners were trying to get the legislation that was passed in order to preserve themselves from being taxed if in the event that their former slaves gain uh, prominence in the legislatures in the South. That's where all of this crap started. And it's affecting now. You don't have to be black to get screwed by any of these tax laws, but you don't even understand why you're getting screwed. And making sure they passing laws against what they call critical race theory. What that is, passing laws. We don't want these white folks to find, poor white folks to find out how these laws came into play that's protecting they're protecting properties, why they're being taxed out of their homes, why they can no longer being forced out, they can't live for their taxes to pay for their homes anymore. We don't want them to know how that started, where that came from. And so we want to continue the miseducation. And matter of fact, we're going to legislate ignorance in the population for that, about that.
I have, Manny has a question next. Manny, go ahead.
I think. Let me see.
Manny, were you there or?
Unmute. Hello.
Oh, there you
Can you
go.
hear me
There we
now?
go. Hi, Manny.
Okay, hi. I want to say thank you. That is amazing what you just talked about, the Jim Crow reparations. And but I want an answer, okay? Hopefully. So I live in Massachusetts, and we all know that this is not our land. All this land belongs to the Native Americans.
Yes.
Let's put it this way, okay? I just found out about Tulsa, and I'm very, very bothered by it. So when you talk about reparations, I talk about something else. Why is it that we haven't found these criminals that committed all these offenses, even from the Jim Crow, protected by the police? Why haven't we go after their families, and make them pay what their parents did? And I'm going all the way to Tulsa, to what happened with Detroit. Why haven't we? I mean, we got records. There's records. There's got to be names of these people. Why haven't we go to the courts and made their sons and daughters and descendants pay for what they did? Why haven't we? What is it going to take? Because this generation keeps doing this, then there's going to be other generations that are going to say, okay, now they didn't do that to them. Now we can do it again. No. This has to stop. And everything they said about the Jim Crow and everything, how much people are paid. We know that Florida, we know that Texas. I mean, you remember that Mexicans became immigrants while they were living in California because the United States stole their land. They went to Puerto Rico and they stole our land. So we need to see why haven't these people pay, and what is it going to take for us to make them pay? There is sheriffs that were involved in Tulsa. Why haven't we go after those people and make them pay?
Well, there are some states that are passing, some counties that are passing some laws of reparations, for redlining and for property confiscation. What has to do? See, one of the fears is what is happening now. The system was set up. Let's be clear. The system was set up. It was never thought that the system would evolve to a system where white males with property would have any control and would have any say in the government. That's how the Constitution systemic chauvinistic bias was built into the Constitution for white males with property. That was the initial systemic bias in the Constitution. And so it never envisioned that it would be anything other. So when the Civil War, it didn't work. For those who said that it worked, it didn't work. It led to the greatest fratricidal civil war in the history of mankind. The greatest shedding of brother blood against brother was over the failure of the Constitution of 1787. You know, it didn't. It led to the war in 1960. Over 600,000 of sacrificed in that. Now, the real founding of our Constitution is the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And that 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment came about when they had to expand the franchise beyond that of free white males. Now, here's the other part of history that they are concerned of you understand. The modern Constitution that you have today, most of your rights flow out of the 14th Amendment in the first clause of the 14th Amendment, not the founding fathers' Constitution. Most of the rights, for women rights, the rights for LGBT community, it come out of what? Do they go back to anything in the founding fathers? What did it go to? The 14th Amendment. Voting rights for women, that came down to coming out of the 14th Amendment. And so what happened was, in order to get that passed, they could not get a majority of the white population to vote for the 14th Amendment. So what they passed in March the 2nd, 1867, they put the southern states under martial law and passed the Reconstruction Act, and they enfranchised the former slaves for the first time to vote. African Americans were allowed to vote 3 years before there was a 15th Amendment to the Constitution that said you could not deny the right to vote because of race, color, or creed. The irony of our Constitution is that blacks had to be given the vote in order to vote for the right to vote. That's how perverse our Constitution is. And when they put the southern states and they tried to say you could not come back into this union unless you pass the 14th Amendment, the white voters of the South say, we ain't gonna vote for no 14th Amendment. As a matter of fact, most of northern whites said we're not gonna vote for no 14th Amendment. So a minority of whites in the Congress, led by Thaddeus Stephenson in the legislature, in the House, and Charles Sumner said, well, we gonna have to disfranchise most of the white population of this country in order to pass these amendments. And so in essence, what they did is say, if you supported the Confederacy, you got to pledge allegiance to the Union. If you support the Confederacy, you cannot participate in the vote until 1970. That was the first draft of the 14th Amendment. In other words, they said no whites who supported for the Confederacy going to be able to vote in the first presidential election following the Civil War. So I want you to understand, now, many people don't understand this, that in the first presidential election following the Civil War, Ulysses Grant lost the white vote, a majority of the white vote. The reason why Ulysses Grant won is because ex-slaves were enfranchised under a military provision called the Military Reconstruction Act of March 2nd, and they registered former slaves. At the end of registration in 1867, the majority of Southerners that were eligible to vote in the first presidential election in 1868 were former slaves. In other words, former slaves outnumbered the number of Southern whites who could vote in the Southern states in the first presidential election. And when they had, and Grant won the popular vote because they made up, as we do today, they were about 12% of the population, but they went over 90% for Ulysses Grant. And let me pause here to say that meant that there were at least 10% of blacks who voted to be slaves. So I want to say, don't let us not get all hung up. We got it all right. See? So that 10% still exists today. We got a foolhardy 10% of us, but at least it ain't only 10%. You got 90% going wrong, okay? And so the reason why we have a 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution today is because of the vote of ex-slaves. Southern whites know this history. A lot of progressive whites don't know this history. That's why Southern whites know that their ancestors didn't vote for the 14th Amendment. They know that their ancestors didn't vote for the 15th Amendment or the 13th Amendment. As a matter of fact, there was no bipartisan support for the 14th Amendment. Do you know how many of the opposite party at that time, think of the Democratic Party then as the Republican Party now, okay? The opposing party who voted for the 14th Amendment when they adopted was 0. There were absolutely no votes for the other party for the 14th Amendment. What was the vote for the 15th Amendment of the Democratic Party at that time? 0. The 14th and 15th Amendment were passed on a totally partisan, veto-proof Congress. There is no progressive legacy for partisanship in the history of this country. All progressive movements have been partisan, totally partisan. Bipartisanship brought us the Free Fifth Clause at the Constitutional Convention. Bipartisanship brought us Jim Crow laws following the Civil War. It was partisanship that ended the Free Fifth Clause and the bipartisan Free Fifth Compromise in the Constitution of 1787. It was partisanship that ended Jim Crow. And so supermajority is always been a tool for a white minority to checkmate a white majority that may go crazy and actually believe in the founding declaration that all of us are created equal and we must have equitable outcomes. And so we owe our, since you owe so much to our vote, see, and so they realize that. So they say, the reason why we in the state we are today, we have a 14th, 15th Amendment is because we let the vote of the wishes of ex-slaves become prominent over the wishes of the white majority. And we're going to see that that never occurs again. And that is what is happening in these Jim Crow suppression laws now. And we must set up a system where a white minority whose interest is to maintain white privilege will be able to checkmate any majority, be it black, be it white, be it purple, that wants to undermine property, privilege, and racial privilege.
Thank you.
Asa, we have Chuck on stack. They have a question.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And also, I wanted to let you know we have about 9 minutes left. Okay.
I just want to say I appreciate Manny's sense of justice and his indignation at injustice. Yes. And you know, if I tracked the lecture today, the focus was on getting reparations based on the tax scheme at the time and drawing some value and coming up with a number. And I get that. And I've also heard other people have come up with $1 trillion figure or multi-trillion for accounting for all aspects of not just Jim Crow in the South, but the redlining that occurred in the North and all of that. And but what's also coming up for me is that how important a Green senator would be to kind of break that supermajority problem that you've described. And as things stand in our government, we're pretty much, it's the same old of that minority filibuster, the minority of the kind of the tyranny of the minority. So I get that too. And I don't really have I have an observation about, what could the Greens do with their call for reparations? And I agree with Manny that could be an interesting claim to say families that benefited in Tulsa. I mean, right now there are people living in Tulsa who are the beneficiaries of that massacre, of that pogrom, if you will, of that, and the same would be true in other places where land grabs occurred and so on. And then shadowing all of this is the plight of the Native American, who also kind of deserves a reparation. And I'm wondering if, not to slight anybody or diminish anybody's claims or anything like that, but that almost I'm wondering if the Green Party, make clear that reparations is complicated, that there are multiple claims that could be conceivably made, and that our call for reparation is part of our call to kind of heal and restore nature, and heal the harm and the cruel, and the injustices. So that's just a thought. I just wanted to share that. And I appreciate you.
The thing is, the whole point of Jim Crow reparations is to educate and say, stop this nonsense that this is ancient. That Jim Crow reparations, this thing, you say this is going on and we are feeling the effects of it today. And you suckers out there, you being paying the price for your ignorance of what has happened in the confiscation of Native Americans' land and the apartheid systems that we have set up. You are being exploited in your rule errors from being able to get the resources you need in order to change and improve your life, because you don't understand how these systems have been put into place in order to, you think, benefit your advantage, but actually it was focused on property, on being biased toward property, and that bias has affect everyone. And the way what Nanny is talking about and what we all are talking about, the Greens should be about, is saying that stop making like this is some ancient thing that goes all the way back to the slave trade. I'm a little concerned. I say, look, they are living victims of there are people who are benefiting now from these kind of racist policies and institutional policies. They are getting money in their pocket now. And they need to give up some of that money now to people who are victimized now, who are living like me. I'm setting up, like I say, a savings plan for my grandchildren. I said, heck, man, I should be getting money from the people who segregated from me all that time. There's all that money that my daddy paid taxes for me to go to a segregated school. Why can't I tap into that money to put into this account that I want to set up for my grandkids, And so that's just one example. See, and then it's talking about all kinds of examples that but the Greens should be about, he said, we want to make, there are all kinds of reparations that are owed. I want you to understand, do you know that in Germany today, there's no debate about Germans who are paying reparations for what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust? They pay reparations to Jews today in Germany. There are taxes that are being paid out for that. And that generation that had nothing to do with that generation under Hitler and got nothing to say about what happens to that money. See, that's going on. And the same thing is, we're paying reparations right now to Israel. We pull money in there with this kind of a reparations to subsidize their settlements on other people's territories. There are all kinds of reparations that arrive out of the systems of apartheid in all of its different forms. And Jim Crow and the Green Party needs to go be out front in educating the public to how reparations is not a subject about what did happen, but what is happening. And what is happening now. Reparations, recompensation for what is going on now. And what Manny's talking about is identifying people who are benefiting from that now so they cannot escape and say, well, that was back then. I had nothing to do with that. Nonsense. You getting pocket change right now as a benefit from what your daddy did, and what you are supporting now, whether you're conscious or not. So that's really what Jim Crow reparations is about. Jim Crow reparations is trying to move the needle away from a focus on, this is something that happened a long time ago and we need to confiscate people. I'm being selfish. Yes, I do want my people to get compensated for what happened during slavery, but I want my money for what happened to me in my lifetime. Now, I don't want my grandchildren be petitioning for Jim Crow reparations. I want the Jim Crow now while I'm still alive. Nanny needs it now. All of us need it now for what's happening to us today. I ain't got too many tomorrows to look forward to.
So we're getting to be about a minute away for today. I appreciate this so much. Thank you for putting all this together. And for those of us that want to get more involved, how do we get involved in the Green Party to learn more about our reparations platform?
Well, the Black Caucus, I think, has endorsed Jim Crow reparations. So follow the literature that they have. The other thing is, if you want to get a lot of my just Google Asa Gordon Electoral College, okay, and you'll get some of this information. But actually, once you get the thesis of what I'm doing, that the mantra is no taxation without representation, no taxation for perverse representation. And so Greens, whoever Green you are, look for how taxation is perverse. And in its perversity is an argument for reparations for that perversity in the taxation, whether it be regressive, taxation. So when white people have start arguing about reparations for how this tax system is set up in order to protect property and capital gains, but not my income. Why is it the poorer I am, the more I pay of my income compared with those who are rich? That's colorblind. But that's a reparations argument. But in order to make those arguments, you have to understand our history, the real history of what was behind supermajorities, the real history of what how Constitution scheme was set up.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We're at 6:21, so we're going to have to say goodnight for now. Thank you again so much. And to everyone that came out today, and can we saying we can look them up look up for Asa Gordon online to learn more about what he's been doing. And I look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you so much again, everyone. Good night.
Everyone. Good night.
Mm-hmm. Bye-bye.
Peace.
Peace.
Take it easy, Mom.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much again. All right. Good night.
Okay, I'm sorry I didn't. I'm wondering if this may have happened to others. Now the redirect I did, I redirected to my my iPad in the
Yeah.
share, but something popped up on my computer. I could see it on my computer. Like it was a Zoom that was trying to sell some kind of a product or something like that. You know,
Right.
some kind of product that they were trying to.
So I wonder if that's, yeah, I wonder if that's, are you using the app? Because I'm not really an expert at Zoom at all, but maybe if the app came on, you know, and then it wants to give you that ad on there. I really haven't seen it before.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a shame because I know it can be very confusing for me. You know, like I said, I'm not used to it. You have more experience with this than I do probably. So, but that's weird that it came up like that.
Oh yeah, well, I'm glad. I got
Yeah.
lost there for a while. I'm sorry.
No,
about that.
it was brilliant. I really appreciate it. And for all those little tiny things, I think we worked together and you were right back on to where you were, you know, it didn't take you off track very much at all. So I
All right.
appreciate that. All right.
Hey,
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
for hosting
All right.
this.
Have a good night.
All right, good night.
Bye-bye.